House debate for the 18th District between incumbent Republican Brian Mast and Democratic challenger Lauren Baer. They discussed environmental issues, the ongoing Mueller investigation, gun control, and the Brett Kavanaugh Supreme Court nomination. Held in West Palm Beach, this is 50 Minutes.
This is a WPTV News Channel 5 special. Democrat Lauren Baer challenging Republican Congressman Brian Mast, the 18th Congressional District debate.
Good evening, I'm Michael Williams and welcome to the debate for Congressional District 18 covering Martin, St. Lucie and parts of Palm Beach County. The contest that is being watched nationally as the House is up for grabs between Republicans and Democrats. 23 seats, if the Democrats can win them, would turn control from Republicans to Democrats. I'm joined by the incumbent, Brian Mast, the Republican and Army veteran, and his challenger, Lauren Baer, a Democrat, attorney, foreign policy advisor for the State Department under the Obama administration. This is a debate in which we have a lot to cover, and the candidates, we want to give them substantive time to answer questions. I won't allow any filibustering, but we will allow them to have give and take on the issues of the day, above and beyond what you might normally expect. And in this pivotal general election campaign, we think that that is important. Also, they will be able to respond to critiques from one another, although those will be shorter in length. As always, I'll moderate and try and move things along. By the flip of a coin, the first question of this debate goes to you, Congressman Mast. Talk about the toxic algae crisis and talk about what you've done, what you'll continue to do, but do so against the backdrop of the critique from your opponent that you've done too little and done it late in the game. And she notes, among other things, that your scorecard from the League of Conservation Voters is a very low 23. Talk about it.
Absolutely. So number one, Michael, you and I sat in this studio over 2 years ago. I laid out to you the exact plan of how I was going to fight our algal issues. I said I was going to go out there and get on the transportation of infrastructure. I did that, and I said I was going to work on one bill specifically, the Water Resources and Development Act. And recently the Senate passed that bill after the House passed that bill, and I had 9 individual bills rolled into that large piece of legislation that I had been working on literally for the last 2 years. One of those provisions being the reservoir south of Lake Okeechobee. Another one of those provisions demanding that the Lake Okeechobee regulation schedule be redone. I wrote a bill saying that we need to work on harmful algal blooms and hypoxia research, getting NOAA and the EPA to go out there and work on those issues and fund cleaning them up. I wrote a bill saying that we have to make human health and human safety the #1 priority when dealing with these issues. And you want to talk about the backdrop of critique about the League of Conservation Voters. I would say this, the League of Conservation Voters, while they score different votes, they did not score one of those items. They didn't score to the Water Resources and Development Act or the reservoir south of Lake Okeechobee or redoing the Lake Okeechobee regulation schedule. One of the things that they did score is asking me to vote to fund green nail salons. That's one of the things that they scored. And I'd make one other critique, and that would be this. You know, my opponent and I have both sat in the studio with you doing different interviews. And when she was in her primary interview with you, she told you very specifically water would not be her #1 priority. It is my #1 priority. And you replied to her, Ms. Baer, as the district is literally embroiled in toxic algal blooms, how can you say that water is not your #1 issue? It's the #1 issue for me, and I'm proud of that.
Let me let you answer that critique. First of all, from the congressman, answer both that critique and what you would do differently going forward when it comes to the algae crisis and indeed the red tide crisis that we've been consumed with of late. Ms. Baer.
Well, first of all, Michael, thank you for having both of us here, and thank you, Congressman, for joining us this evening. It's without dispute that the algal crisis that we are dealing with is an environmental crisis. It is a public health crisis, and it's an economic crisis for our community. It has to be a top priority of anyone we are electing. But let me also remind you, we're not electing a single issue congressperson this year. We need to elect someone who is competent and capable of addressing the myriad issues that affect our district right now, including our healthcare crisis as well. But let's talk about the algal crisis for a moment. When Representative Mast was elected to Congress, toxic algae covered 200 square miles of Lake Okeechobee. This year it covered more than 650. We knew what the problem was when he went into office, and yet he waited more than a year to do anything substantive and meaningful. And what he has done at this point doesn't address the underlying problem here, which is that polluters are dumping nutrients into the lake which are causing these algal blooms. As long as we are only dealing with it as outflows from the lake, as a problem of discharges, not what's going into the lake from Sugar in the south, from the Kissimmee in the north, we're never going to be able to remedy these algal blooms. Now, you might ask, why doesn't he want to deal with the issue of who's dumping into the lake? Well, all you need to look at are the polluters that line his campaign coffers, and the fact that he's consistently taken votes, not on green nail salons, but to raise the stream protection rule, to allow people to dump into our water, to gut the EPA, to allow a climate change denialist at the head of the EPA, to understand why exactly it is he's got that failing grade from League of Conservation Voters.
Let me let you answer that critique, sir.
Certainly. So I recently put up on my website 30 things that I did working on our waterways prior to Ms. Baer ever even registering to vote in this district. And to go on beyond the myriad of things that I already listed, from the Southern Reservoir, getting that passed through Congress, it's going to the President's desk, redoing the Lake Okeechobee regulation schedule. We've also worked on raising the Tamiami Trail, that road that goes across the Everglades, so that more water can flow south. We've worked on,
began before you went to Congress.
And we've worked on making sure that the funding is in place for all of that. We've literally put every dollar that was needed to repair the Herbert Hoover Dike. Every dollar needed to repair that dike was put into the Corps of Engineers this year, so that the dike's going to be repaired probably 2 years sooner, probably repaired by 2021. The dollars and the resources to make sure that the Kissimmee River restoration is something that is brought to completion, so that we do address those flows of nutrients coming in along the Kissimmee River. And I have been somebody that has been calling loudly, not just at the Corps of Engineers, but also at various South Florida Water Management District meetings, at Rivers Coalition meetings, saying that we need to label those pollutants that are coming into the waters point source pollutions and make sure that they're stopped immediately.
What can you do as a freshman in Congress, should you win this election, that will speed things along more quickly than somebody who's been there? We're talking about a dike that hopefully is finished by 2021-22. The reservoir project with final funding would take at least 10 years to complete. What substantively could you do any differently as it regards dealing with the toxic algae crisis and that flow coming east and indeed west as well, of course?
Well, I read Congressman Mast's list of actions in his first year of office, and it seems that he wrote a lot of letters to different people. Well, that's something I could do as a private citizen. That's something environmentalists in our community have been doing for years. That's something business owners who've been affected by these algal blooms have been doing. That's something that people who've been getting sick have been doing.
So
what you can do as
what you can do
as a congressman is propose legislation on day one.
And what would
My
you propose?
critique of Representative Mast's legislation is that it came too late. Those ideas were out there in the first place.
What would you propose differently?
Hard limits on the amount of nitrogen and phosphorus that can go into the lake. We need to be ensuring that there's greater monitoring and oversight from the EPA, an agency that Representative Mast has been totally comfortable gutting. And we need to be making sure that we are fully funding and implementing the comprehensive Everglades restoration plan. We shouldn't be patting ourselves on the back that we've just approved the EAA reservoir when there are almost 60 more items in that plan to do. We've had that around since the year 2000. It's 20 years later now. Why are we only doing one thing at a time?
Answer her critique about gutting the EPA. It's been a central issue, a hot button issue nationally. Answer that critique in charge. And others have critiqued as well and have argued that while you've done a lot, you could have done even more sooner.
So I've gone out very specifically and spoke against the administration on different bills, one of the bills being a rescissions package where they were looking to take money out of defending waterways from agricultural runoff, things like that. And I fought to make sure that those things were not included. That's one of the places that I pushed back on that front. There are a number of other places. I am out there fighting on this issue every single day as the number one thing that I work on, that my staff in Washington works on, and my staff in Florida works on. And to that critique about writing letters, that's an important thing. When we talk about redoing the Lake Okeechobee regulation schedule, that's something that we have to have the proof out there, letters back from the Corps of Engineers, from the Water Management District, from mayors on the other coast, and other people saying these are the problems. I ask questions, I get the responses, I get it on record, so that when we have that fight, we have all the tools that we need in place so that we can win that battle and keep those discharges from coming into our community.
Briefly, very briefly on this one, do either of you take any contributions? I know the answer, but I want to put you on record from sugar or ag interest in this campaign cycle.
I am the only representative in the history of representing this district that has not taken contributions from the agriculture industry and has voted against sugar subsidies.
Not only do I not take money from sugar, I don't take money from any corporate PACs, because I don't believe corporate money has a role to play in our political system.
And a final critique before we move on to a next key topic, which will be health care for you at home. But before we move on to that, answer the critique about lining your political pockets, according to your opponent, with polluter money.
So the fact of the matter is, both Ms. Baer and myself have had contributions into our campaigns from political action committees. She's had a number of contributions from Nancy Pelosi's political action committee, Debbie Wasserman Schultz's political action committee. All of those political action committees are funded by corporations around the country, which means they are actually funding her campaign as well. And I would give you one other important point on this. I recently watched a video of Ms. Baer in Washington, D.C. at a major D.C. law firm filled with mega D.C. donors, where she was telling a joke, and this is why this is a hypocritical point by my opponent. She made the joke that she started her career starting out trying to get money out of politics, and isn't it ironic and hypocritical that there she is in front of all of these mega donors asking for money and everybody laughed? That's why this is a hypocritical point.
Response, then we're going to move on.
Not hypocritical at all. I did start my career fighting to get money out of politics, and I think it's absolutely despicable the amount of money that candidates have to raise in order to compete in congressional races. That's why I've joined a team of challengers in putting a letter that was published in the Wall Street Journal this past week saying that we'll put at the top of our agenda a reform item as a bill number 1 should we get elected. Because I think that if we're going to restore our faith in government, the people of America and the people of this district need to know that their congressperson is voting in their interests, not for special interests. I have been very, very clear throughout about the importance of campaign finance reform.
We're going to wrap on the toxic algae crisis, though certainly both of you would agree we could talk about that crucial issue for many hours. But another key issue, locally, statewide, and nationally, health care. You've made it a centerpiece of your campaign, Ms. Baer. Talk about the Affordable Care Act, how you will try to improve upon it and to expand its reach, and within that, the critique you have had quite loudly of your opponent's record therein. Your time.
Let me just be clear to everyone in this district. Healthcare is a right, not a privilege. And in the wealthiest country in the world, no individual should have to make a choice between making ends meet and getting the kind of care that they need. I am out in our community every day talking to people who live in St. Lucie County, for example, where 1 in every 3 adults doesn't have health insurance, or Indiantown, or East Stewart, where people are struggling with rising health care costs and rising prescription drug prices. And Representative Mast, what he has done while he is in Congress is vote in a way that would strip health care from 74,000 of his own constituents, that would jeopardize care for the 272,000 people in this district with pre-existing conditions. He has voted in a way that's estimated to increase the average health care bill and insurance costs of people in this district by $3,000 per family annually. Those votes alone should be disqualifying. Your job as a representative is to represent the people in your district. And if you are taking votes that are actively harming them instead of helping them, that's disqualifying. It just is.
You're talking about a study done by the Center for American Progress. We should note it's a liberal-leaning think tank that said more than 74,000 district residents could have lost their health insurance under the American Health Care Act, which was supposed to be the Republican replacement for the Affordable Care Act that you voted to get rid of. It did not happen, but you voted to get rid of it. Strong critique of your policy. What do you say to constituents in your district who are struggling with health care? What do you say to the critique from your opponent?
So let's start with the critique from Ms. Baer and from the Center for American Progress. Both of them are referencing a Congressional Budget Office report dated March 13, 2017 that didn't say anybody was going to be thrown off their health care. It said very specifically that the increase in uninsured was going to be a direct result of individuals choosing not to buy plans because the Affordable Care Act, Obamacare, has literally made the price of insurance double since its inception. Now, if you want to know what I think we do going forward, when I think about insurance, I think about friends of mine that when they used to be on insurance 10 years ago, they were paying maybe $200 a month and maybe they had a $500 deductible. Those same friends today are paying over $1,000 a month and they have $5,000 deductibles. That's a result of the Affordable Care Act. Ms. Baer had said Obamacare did not go far enough. She supports something known as a Chris Murphy plan, and I'll get to that in one moment. But the direction that we have to go is get competition back into the insurance market. Let people buy the plans that they want to buy. Let people not pay for the things that they don't want to pay for. Not have the government demand that individuals buy things that they don't see fit for themselves. That Chris Murphy plan is an important thing that we have to get to. It's her plan to say millions of Americans be added to the rolls of Medicare, that medical safety net for our seniors that they paid into from the day they started working until the day that they turned 65. And we still sometimes wonder about the solvency of that plan. And she wants to add millions of Americans to those Medicare rolls who have not paid into it their entire life. And let's talk about Chris Murphy, what he said about his own plan. He said that he didn't think that we were going to get to Bernie Sanders' plan right away, but his plan was the pathway to getting to what Bernie Sanders wanted.
Which is Medicare for all.
That's
do you
exactly
support,
right.
First a brief answer, you do not support Medicare for all.
No, but Michael, I'd like to
answer the critique.
Representative Mast what he said first, because when I think about 10 years ago, I think about a time when more than 20 million Americans didn't have health insurance. I think about a time when myself, as a woman who's given birth to a baby, would have had a pre-existing condition because I was pregnant and could have been charged higher rates because of that. I think about a time when my friends who had breast cancer could have been disqualified for coverage because that was a pre-existing condition. I think about a time when you could sell junk insurance plans that didn't cover mental health treatment or treatment for the opioid crisis. I think about a time when our healthcare system was fundamentally in crisis. And if you listen to what Representative Mast he's saying he wants to go back to that time. He wants to go back to that time when fewer Americans were covered, when you constantly lived in fear of whether you were going to get that diagnosis of cancer or diabetes, of whether your kid was going to be born with epilepsy. And he's saying that it's okay, And when you look at what he's saying about choice, I haven't met a single person in our district when costs go up because of the bill that he passed, who said they're choosing not to have health insurance. I don't know anyone who doesn't want to be covered.
You took heat in town halls over the summer for your position on repealing the Affordable Care Act. It was a bottom line pledge from Republicans. Ultimately, it did not happen. Answer to the viewers watching now, say, wrong call.
So let's take all of those points that Ms. Baer just made. And I would tell you that in Section D, subsection 137, page 91 of the bill that I voted. Page 91 of the bill that I voted on. It said very specifically, nothing in this bill shall be construed as to allow insurance issuers to limit coverage based upon pre-existing conditions. It said the same thing about nothing in this bill shall be construed as to allow to rate somebody based upon their gender.
You never supported getting rid of pre-existing conditions.
Absolutely not. These were very specific provisions that were written in black ink on white paper in these bills. It was important to me that that was written into law. I'm an individual with pre-existing conditions, and to her critique about wanting to go back to another time, I want to go back to the prices of that time where my friends were paying something that was affordable, $200, not $1,000, $500 deductibles, not $5,000 deductibles. That's the place that we need to get back to, and that means giving Americans choice.
Ms. Baer, so you're talking about a private marketplace. Certainly we have Medicare there, a government-run program, but you're talking about largely getting back to as much private choice as possible. You've talked about expanding to universal care, but not Medicare for all. Explain what you mean to constituents.
Sure, but let's talk about the facts about what happened to pre-existing conditions. The bill that was passed by the Republican-controlled Congress would have allowed states to opt out of what was required by the Affordable Care Act. That including allowing states to opt out of coverage for pre-existing conditions or charge individuals multiple times higher on account of having pre-existing conditions. And what all of the objective, nonpartisan studies have shown was that it would have effectively rendered care completely inaccessible for people who actually had pre-existing conditions. You have to look at the effect of what the bills actually do. Now, as for the plan that I would have to expand access to care, I'm not in support of a Bernie Sanders Medicare for all system. I'm in support of market-based expansion towards universal coverage. Now, what that means is allowing individuals and small businesses to buy into Medicare and Medicaid in the same way that they would buy into another insurance program. Now, why is this good? As government programs, the costs tend to be lower in these programs. They tend to bring medical costs down, it gives individuals essentially a public option, something they can choose instead of the high cost of private insurance. And in a market like ours, in a district like ours, where some parts of it, there's only one insurance plan available, what that does is provide additional options. But there's no way that I've been in favor of moving towards a single-payer system. That's something you know I took heat from in the primary from my own party.
What's wrong with what she's saying?
So number one, she said very clearly that she wants to put millions of Americans onto the Medicare rolls that our seniors depend on. Our seniors paid into that program literally their entire working life.
But if she can fund it, what's the problem?
But they can't fund that. That's the reality. We're talking about a system that people paid into their entire life, and we still talk about the solvency of it. The idea is to add people that haven't paid into it their entire life, and then when their medical costs exceed what it is that they paid in, who has to pay the price for that? Our seniors have to pay the price for that. Now, like I said, let's talk about how this gets us to the Bernie Sanders plan. The author of this bill, Chris Murphy, said very specifically in his own interviews that he didn't think he could get to the Bernie Sanders plan right away, but this was his highway to getting to the Bernie Sanders plan. Every original co-sponsor of the Chris Murphy bill was an original co-sponsor of the Bernie Sanders healthcare Medicare for All plan. This is the pathway to getting to Medicare for all.
We have to go to break, but I'll give you 20 seconds.
He can say whatever he wants about what Chris Murphy said. I'm going to tell you what I'm saying right here, which is that I'm in support of a plan that would allow
Chris Murphy, by the way, for those of you at home,
individuals and small businesses to buy into Medicare and Medicaid. That's not adding anyone to the rolls. That's allowing individuals to put their dollars towards these programs, buying that insurance. His critique is simply not valid.
Algae, healthcare, two of the central issues of this campaign, and we will continue on other topics important to this race that is being watched nationally. All that and more when we come back. Please stay with us. Welcome back to the Congressional District 18 debate. Brian Mast, Lauren Baer, the Republican and Democrat, here tonight with us on air and online, and we thank them for that. Before we move into other topics, your positions are well known, but I do want to briefly ask for any of you who may not be aware, watching, Brightline. You've been strongly opposed. Briefly, why? From both of you.
Certainly. There are a number of safety concerns. There are a number of convenience concerns around the community. And I've worked to get proposals in place by the regulators of train safety to say that there shouldn't be more than 60 minutes out of every 120-minute period for those trains to go over our rail bridges. There should be some maritime rush hours. I've worked and actually succeeded in getting some regulation as it relates to those trains coming through our district.
Ms. Baer.
I've been very clear about this from the start. This train doesn't go through the Treasure Coast unless it's safe and actually benefits our community.
I want to talk about some other topics, and I know you've all talked on the campaign trail a great deal about Brightline, but given limited time, I want to move on to other topics that many have argued in the last few weeks become the litmus test for 2018 and perhaps 2020. First, we're talking about Brett Kavanaugh and the polarizing debate nationally that ultimately led to his seat on the U.S. Supreme Court. Already, some have argued in Democratic circles that should they win the House, they need 23 seats, including this one, to do it. They'll put impeachment on the table. And a New York Times reporter said, "Don't kid yourself," recently. He said that also, should Democrats win the House, Donald Trump and impeachment there will be a topic that will immediately be brought to the forefront. First, on Brett Kavanaugh, your take on what happened recently, and would you support a call for impeachment of Brett Kavanaugh, Ms. Baer, should you be elected to the House, and should the Democrats win control of that House?
So I look at this issue with my lawyer hat on. And as a lawyer, I know that the reason we have faith in our Supreme Court to adjudicate the most controversial cases in our country is because the court is seen as being above politics. Now, I don't know anyone who could have watched the Kavanaugh hearings take place earlier, a few weeks ago, and believe, after watching that our court is still above politics. And that's problematic, because when we don't have faith in our Supreme Court as being impartial, as being able to fairly judge claims, that starts to erode at our democracy. Now, I also look at this as a woman, frankly, as a woman who, unfortunately, like I think every woman out there, knows people, women in her life, who have been subject to harassment, sexual violence, discrimination in school or in the workplace or in the halls of government. And as a woman, I look at the spectacle that became of that hearing, where credible allegations were brought forth by someone, and it seemed that the Republican-controlled Senate Judiciary Committee was more concerned with rushing to a conclusion and a confirmation than fully getting at the truth. And I understand why so many women are disappointed in the result of that, when disappointment means a lifetime of making decisions about things like women's reproductive health. Now, as for your question on impeachment, again, looking at this as a lawyer, I don't rush to impeachment for anything. I haven't seen facts that would seem to warrant that.
Do you rule it out, though?
I don't rule anything out until there are investigations. I'm a process person.
Would you resist pressure? There's a quote this is the quote. A well-known Democratic strategist said the only question, should Democrats regain control of the House, is who calls for impeachment first. Would you be able to resist that call?
Well, I never trust well-known strategists of either party who don't give their name. What I will say is that I'm not going to impeach anyone in any circumstance in which there hasn't been an investigation proving grounds for impeachment. And that stands for Brett Kavanaugh, and that stands for Donald Trump.
Let me add, Louis Gutierrez, Democrat of Illinois, and Ted Lieu, Democrat of California, have put their names, at least flirting with the idea. Your response to Ms. Baer's comments and to the furor over the Brett Kavanaugh nomination and ultimately his seating on the United States Supreme Court.
So first, what Ms. Baer said about the court's supposed to be above politics. When we have a confirmation process where those that are going out there looking to confirm somebody going to the Supreme Court are playing politics right from the very beginning, that's not hyperbole. Chuck Schumer saying within 30 minutes of these names being announced that he will oppose the nominee with everything that he has without even vetting the individual, knowing anything about it, reading FBI reports that had come out on this individual from other proceedings as Brett Kavanaugh was with different administrations. Having never looked at that, it already became political. Now, she spoke about looking at this through or rather having a hat of a lawyer on. I look at this wearing my hat as a father. And I can tell you that I have a little girl. And if my little girl ever made any accusation, I would want that accusation to be taken 100% seriously. I wouldn't want somebody to play politics with it. I would want it to go to law enforcement. I would want it to be dealt with the correct way that these things are dealt with. And I have two little boys, and I have a little boy on the way. And there's never a moment that I would want my little boys to have their right of being presumed innocent stripped from them simply because of a political process. That's not right, and it's something that was stripped out of these proceedings, and I would absolutely stand against impeachment proceedings for Brett Kavanaugh.
Was that right of due process stripped from Mr. Kavanaugh?
No, it wasn't. And frankly, let's look at the situation here. No individual is entitled to a lifetime appointment on the Supreme Court. When we are picking jurists for the highest court in the land, only 9 individuals in the entire United States. We are looking at individuals' judicial judgment, we're looking at their experience, and we're looking at their character. Now, where the congressman and I can agree on here is that process somehow went astray. But the difference is that I would have liked to have seen more process. I would have liked to have seen a lengthier investigation to fully air and get to the bottom of these allegations that were raised. I think we all could have had a little bit of more faith in the process if that had happened. But instead, what we saw was a rush to confirmation before the midterm elections. And the notion that somehow the Democratic Party is playing politics with the Supreme Court when the Republican Party held the nomination and any kind of hearing for Merrick Garland without precedent for more than a year, it's simply unfathomable to me.
President Trump, this is what the White House correspondent for the New York Times said just recently. While Democrats are largely ducking the topic on the campaign trail, few in Washington doubt impeachment will be on the table if they win the House November 6th. They need 23 seats to do so, as we've said to you at home, including this one, should you go on to win that seat, Ms. Baer. If that happens, the correspondent says, anyone who thought the battle over Justice Kavanaugh's confirmation was ugly and divisive should buckle up.
I have no doubt that were Democrats to win the House, impeachment proceedings would be on the table, although they absolutely should not be. The fact of the matter is the president has done an outstanding job leading this country, bringing us to economic prominence, making sure that our foreign policy around the world is something that is sound and strong. When you talk about the work that's done in moving the embassy in Israel from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, tearing up the terrible Iran deal that gave $150 billion to the largest state sponsor of terror, allowing Russia, one of our biggest aggressors, to purchase 90% of the fissile material from Russia, bringing North and South Korea together, having the remains remains of our fighters who are missing in action from the Korean War return to the United States of America, working towards fair trade policies across the world. An incredible job has been done.
You have not mentioned potential Russian collusion in the campaign and the still unfinished Mueller probe. Were that to reveal stark new details, would that potentially change your mind?
The fact of the matter is, I never rule anything out when I'm looking at what's going on in there, but there has been nothing presented whatsoever to say that there's been any collusion between the President of the United States and the Russians. And the fact of the matter is that this is something that occurred under a previous administration where Russia was interfering with our elections, an administration that was unwilling to acknowledge that Russia was a foe. And I believe that there's a great deal of blame to go around from that previous administration.
Ms. Baer, again, the argument is, and you've heard it, you're tied very closely with your work in Washington. You're well known in national Democratic circles. And the argument is Democrats win. Watch out, here comes impeachment proceedings. Your take on that, and you're shaking your head.
Michael, I've been on record on this many times. I've been on record on this on your show before, being very clear that I don't think anyone should raise the question of impeachment until Robert Mueller's investigation is brought to its full conclusion. Now, what I would note here is that investigation is looking not only at collusion, but it's looking at Russian meddling in the United States electoral process, something that all 17 of our U.S. intelligence agencies agree upon, something that this president has consistently discredited. And Congressman Mast has never been willing to speak out and defend the Mueller investigation, say it needs to be brought to its conclusion, say that the American people deserve to know the truth in order to have faith in our democracy. We have elections coming up, and hanging over the shadow of those elections is the knowledge that a foreign adversary interfered in our presidential elections, and that our current president is cozying up to the president of that country, a known dictator. And Representative Mast is silent on that. I think when we're asking ourselves about what's going to restore faith in our system, in our democracy, we have to ask ourselves, do we want individuals representing us in Congress who are going to be silent when the very core of our democracy is being eroded?
Brief response.
Certainly. So let's look at that investigation and the way investigations are supposed to occur. We are allowed to go out there and investigate individuals for crimes that may have been committed. What we do not do to any individual is just go out there and investigate them into perpetuity, hoping that we find anything that could possibly be dug up about a person. That's not the way that we investigate individuals, and everybody deserves not to be investigated in that way.
We'll have to leave those topics there for the moment at least. I want to move to another topic. February 14th, a dark day in the nation's history, certainly one for our community, the Parkland tragedy, 17 lives lost. You went into to the New York Times with an op-ed supporting a ban on semi-automatic assault-style weapons. Talk about your view on guns and compare and contrast, as Ms. Baer will, your view versus hers. But first, where you stood, where you stand now, especially with those who call not only for that ban, but for more robust measures as well.
So I didn't just write that piece on assault weapons. I also went to the memorial ceremonies of one of the friends that I lost, Coach Feist, who was somebody that I knew personally. I know many of the families of the fallen children, so this is very personal to me. I've spoke about many of the things that I want to see come as a result of this in terms of legislation. But I didn't just talk about it. I actually went out there and stepped out of my corner in a way that Republicans hadn't done before. I didn't attack other people, and I actually brought about the only bipartisan piece of legislation that talks anything about assault weapons. It was signed onto by Representative Tulsi Gabbard. Her and I are both on this legislation, and that's what we have to do.
That would do what, for those who don't know?
So that piece of legislation specifically called for a 6-month pause, ban, hold for a very specific purpose. It said, and I wrote it in this way: everybody after Parkland agreed on something, that the system failed on 1,000 different levels. The FBI and the ATF failed in their background checks. The state agencies failed when they were looking into Nicholas Cruz. The Sheriff's Department failed when they were going out there and looking at the attack on the school. The school boards failed. There were also failures with Omar Mateen in Orlando. There were failures with Stephen Paddock in Las Vegas. And so my point in getting out there on this was saying, if everybody agrees that the system failed on 1,000 different levels, then how do we not pause come together, address this issue within the confines of the Second Amendment and say what can happen, what needs to happen. Look at people with mental illness, look at drug testing, look at background checks on all sales, look at all of these things, but come back to the American people with what needs to happen.
Ms. Baer, you've said not enough. Talk about your policy. You've heard what the congressman had to say, your concerns or criticisms if you have them therein, but also what you think needs to be done in this debate that seems to be ongoing and never ending.
First of all, this is something that touched me very deeply, as it did everyone in our district. I lived in Parkland for a year as a child, spent a year of elementary school just down the road from Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School. I used to go to debate tournaments there. When I was a high schooler myself, I'm a mom who can't imagine sending her daughter to school one day and not having her come home. And I'm also someone who's been talking to folks in our community who are saying, enough is enough. More than 20 years after Columbine, enough is enough. Now, I have to say, as one of Representative Mast's constituents, I was initially encouraged by his op-ed. But what's been disappointing is the lack of follow-through, because it's been yet another example of Representative Mast saying one thing to his constituents and then doing something else in Washington. This bill that he proposed, this 60-day temporary pause, it's been more than 200 days. More than 200 days since he proposed a 60-day temporary pause to study the problem. Countless, dozens of individuals have died across our country. And I ask, why didn't he just propose legislation that would do what he said he wanted to do in the first place?
I'm going to let you
get weapons of war off our streets.
I'm going to let you answer that, but how far above and beyond what he did suggest, however much it may be languishing in committee, how much farther do you want to go with gun control?
I've been very clear here. I'm in support of common sense gun safety reforms that the majority of Americans agree on. I think we should have universal background checks. I think we should keep guns out of the hands of abusers, domestic abusers, and the mentally ill. I think we should be banning bump stocks. I think that we should be getting weapons of war off our streets. Now, as with Congressman Mast, I agree that we should not be confiscating guns from their current owners, because I believe in individuals' Second Amendment rights. What I disagree with Congressman Mast is he said he wanted to get assault weapons off our streets, but that didn't co-sponsor legislation that would do exactly that. He wanted a temporary pause to study the problem. Why haven't you studied the problem, Congressman? Why has it been 200 days and you're still waiting for a pause to study the problem while children are dying?
Congressman?
So let's talk about the bill that my opponent would like me to co-sponsor. It's known as the Sisseline-Deutsch bill. And while I have come out of my corner and been willing to work without attacking other people, the most important part about that piece of legislation and why it's not good bill legislation, why it's totally partisan legislation, is that bill calls for a ban on the sales of all semi-automatic firearms through this. It says that any firearm that uses its own energy to chamber another round would be literally not allowed for future sales. That's essentially all semi-automatic weapons. I'm somebody that conceals and carries a firearm almost all of the time. I carry a Glock 9mm. This is something that would no longer be allowed for purchase. People need to be able to go out there and defend themselves. They were guaranteed that right by the Second Amendment. It doesn't guarantee any and all arms, but it guarantees that people, regardless of whether they're part of a militia or not, can still go out there and defend themselves from tyranny or defend their home or defend their family. And this is something that is deeply personal to me as well. There's a local member of the Martin Democrat Party who met my wife, met my children at other events, made it a point to actually meet my family, and then called into my office and said that he was going to kill my children. Being able to defend ourselves is something that's vitally important, deeply important to so many of us, me included, and I'm committed to making sure that that right still exists within the correct parameters. And that bill that she's referencing is not the correct parameters.
We will have to take a break, but we will come back with a final segment on other topics with Lauren Baer, the Democrat, Brian Mast, the incumbent, Congressional District 18. Back in just a moment. Welcome back to the debate for Congressional District 18, covering Martin, St. Lucie, and parts of Palm Beach County. Again, a nationally watched race in the fight to have, retain, or regain control of the U.S. House of Representatives. Brian Mast, Lauren Baer here. We thank you so much for being with us this night. I had a viewer ask me earlier today on Facebook Live, said, ask him about taxes. And it put me to mind of the fact that in 2010, the Tea Party, all candidates were talking about then was the burgeoning federal debt, which doubled under the Obama administration with trillion-dollar deficits now is over $21 trillion. Medicare, Social Security, and defense are the lion's share of each year's budget, more than $1 trillion each for Medicare and Social Security. Many argue that without either a combination of tax increases and benefit cuts, we're going to continue to run this nation into debt oblivion for your children, my children, and our grandchildren. Do you support a tax increase and benefit cuts to start reining in this national debt? A brief response, because I haven't heard either one of you talk about the $21 trillion debt this entire cycle.
So this is something I've worked on during my time in Congress, but to talk about the tax cuts that we signed into law, this is something that has the economy booming. 4% GDP growth, quarter over quarter. President Obama never thought we'd get to 3% GDP growth again. This is one of the ways that we energize the economy. We get more people paying into the payroll taxes. Matters for Social Security, matters for Medicare. Let's talk about the work that I've done to spend less. I voted against a $1.4 trillion omnibus spending bill. Recently, we had something known as the agriculture bill, where we were working in to rein in the entitlement of the SNAP program for individuals that were able-bodied, age 18 to 59, that should be out there working, that were instead collecting these programs. It became very partisan, but that was one of the important ways we worked on cutting spending.
Nonpartisan economists agree, though, unless you're willing to tackle the growth of entitlements, Social Security and Medicare, and or also include tax increases there, you're not going to get there. And as far as the $1 trillion tax cuts, they're arguing that when the initial energy of those cuts goes away, we could be looking at a sharp downturn in the economy in 2019 and 2020. You've heard those reports, very brief. And then I'd like Ms. Baer's response, because you haven't talked about the burgeoning national debt either. Very briefly for you.
There's nothing to indicate that the energy of these tax cuts would go away. When you talk about taking us that was a country that for decades was living under one of the most burdensome corporate tax rates and individual tax rates, and now we're back to being competitive again, and individuals get to go out there and energize the markets because they used to pay 15, now they're paying 12, they used to pay 25, now they're paying 22, they used to pay 28%, now they're paying 24%. This energizes the economy. It's not coming to an end anytime soon.
No tax hikes as long as you're there.
That's right. Ms.
Baer. Same question, same criticism that many offer of both parties about ignoring that $21 trillion and climbing national debt.
Let me tell you how Congressman Mast has worked on our national debt. He's worked on it by increasing it by $1.9 trillion with the T dollars. That tax plan he's talking about, that didn't put more money in the hands of people who actually need it to drive growth from the bottom up. Didn't put money in the pockets of working class and middle class folks. It was a massive tax giveaway to corporations and the ultra wealthy with a $1.9 trillion bill that will be paid by my children and by Congressman Mast's. Or if Paul Ryan and the congressman get his way, it will be paid for by cutting Medicare and Social Security. Now, it grates against me when people call these entitlements, because these aren't entitlements. These are programs that our hardworking seniors have paid into for the entirety of their working careers. 25% of the residents in Florida 18 rely on these programs just to make ends meet. And Republicans are going to put them on the chopping block to give a tax cut to corporations and the ultra wealthy.
Very briefly, why were you not complaining as loudly during the doubling of the national debt under the Obama administration for which you worked?
I have complained about increases in the debt consistently throughout the course of this campaign. Now, during the Obama administration, I was working on foreign policy, so I wasn't really weighing in on that at that point. But I will tell you, Michael, and you know this because I've been on your show, I've been very clear about the danger posed by the Republican tax plan that's going to balloon our national deficit with no way to pay for it. Now, we need to be making smart decisions about budgeting. We need to be not overspending. Any business owner will tell you that. You can't spend more than you have.
You talk often about your work with the Obama administration as a foreign policy advisor, and yet critics of the Obama administration note during his tenure, China has built up its military capability greatly in the South China Sea, argue the Obama administration didn't do enough to deter that, argue that North Korea continued to build its nuclear capability when the Obama administration talked strategic patience, which critics said was basically do nothing. They argued that the Iran deal was flawed. It has since been done away with under the Trump administration. They argued that he drew a red line in Syria. Then when chemical weapons were used, backed off, leaving a vacuum in Syria. How do you defend that record?
Let me tell you what's dangerous to our foreign policy.
But how do you defend that record while you were with the Obama administration?
What's dangerous to our foreign policy, Michael, is a foreign policy that is conducted on Twitter by a rogue president who has gutted the State Department, allowed our senior ranks of diplomats to leave is, by his own admission, making decisions without the guidance of expertise. Now, I worked in the administration, but I was also very clear. I didn't agree with everything that was done, and part of my job within that administration was to advise two different secretaries of state and the U.S. ambassador to the United Nations when I thought our policy was going off in the wrong direction, when we needed to course correct, when we needed to either seize opportunities or mitigate risks. But I don't think there is any way that you can look at the foreign policy of this administration under Donald Trump, who is cozying up to dictators and picking fights with our allies, and argue that somehow that is making us safer and more prosperous than we were before.
And Congressman Mast, very briefly to that critique, what do you say to the ongoing critique that he is cozying up to people like Vladimir Putin, and at the same time, at times seeming to make enemies of friends, including longstanding NATO alliance partners and the like? What would you say to the president about that?
I think the president has done an outstanding job with foreign policy, and those results speak for themselves. I've spoke already about the Iran deal and our enhanced relationship with Israel, but I would speak about why I believe that Ms. Baer is not critiquing the previous administration. She wrote very specifically her thoughts in the days immediately following 9/11. And the thesis of her article that she wrote while sitting at Harvard was that, well, we ask the world to ardently preserve our historic and symbolic values, that America must live up to its shameful history of not standing up for those values itself.
Respond to that.
She's protecting the previous administration because she's called our country hypocritical. She said that we have a shameful history, and she said that immediately after 9/11, we shouldn't emerge more strong and more proud.
Please, Ms. Baer, respond to that direct criticism.
I'm glad to have the opportunity to address head-on Representative Mast's disgraceful misconstrual of what I said. First of all, I want to say that 9/11 had a profound impact on my life. It happened my senior year of college. It's the reason that I went into foreign policy and spent the bulk of my career working to defend American values abroad, because I knew that our country was safer, more prosperous, more secure when other countries around the world are more like us, when they're democratic, when they celebrate human rights. Now, I wrote an op-ed after 9/11, and in that op-ed, I said that I was humbled. I was humbled by the fact that countries around the world saw an attack on America as an attack on themselves. And I said, if other countries can see as an attack on America as an attack on ourselves, then we should see an attack on American values anywhere in the world as an attack on ourselves. And we should be working harder day by day to go out and defend those values. That's what I did in my career. That's what I did when I advised two secretaries of state on how to promote democracy and human rights around the world, which this administration, by its own admission, doesn't do anymore. And frankly, I find it disgraceful, because I have never questioned Congressman Mast's patriotism, and I find it deeply disgraceful that he feels a need to discredit mine.
The paper was titled,
talk about that.
From Hypocrisy to Humanity.
Do you think she's less of a patriot than you?
I think that if I would have said that we have a shameful history and that we should not be more proud and more strong, literally in the days after 9/11, then somebody should say that I am less patriotic. I would encourage you, Ms. Baer, to go to one of the honor flight ceremonies where our World War II veterans, our Korean War veterans, our Vietnam veterans are coming home, and tell them that they haven't stood up for American values. I would encourage you to go out there and speak to people in our community. Friends of mine that served in Somalia, that went out there and lost Army Rangers and Delta operators and Black Hawk pilots, and tell them that they didn't stand up for American values, because that's what you wrote in your op-ed. You said we were hypocritical and we weren't standing up for our values.
I need to give you 30 seconds to respond, and then I want to move to closing, so I don't mean to interrupt, and I think we've worked hard not to, but we're running out of time, unfortunately. Brief response, then closes.
I would invite anyone who wants to read the op-ed I wrote in full. But I'd also like to talk about the many veterans that I do speak to on the campaign trail. Veterans of World War II, individuals who live in places like Century Village and in Stewart, who tell me, I didn't go out and fight for American values to watch a president who's unwilling to stand up for them and a Congress who's unwilling to put that president in check when he's cozying up to dictators, when we fought for our democracy. My entire career has been built on defending American values, and I will do that to my dying day. That is why I am running for this seat.
We must leave the issue debate there. I know there's many things you at home, whether it's immigration or the brouhaha going on with Saudi Arabia right now. We'll have to leave those for another day, but we hope we've helped you form some better idea to compare and contrast, and we'd like to give you 45 seconds to a minute, no more than that, Congressman Mast, for your closing argument to the constituents of District 18.
Look, a lot of people know what happened to me when I was injured in Afghanistan. Let me tell you something that happened after. I woke up in a hospital bed. I had tubes down my throat, tubes down my nose. My hand was sewn to myself. I had vacuums on all the end of my limbs. And I went from being somebody that could literally do nothing. I couldn't roll out of bed if I wanted to. I couldn't feed myself, to somebody that has the honor of representing the most beautiful community that I've ever been a part of. And that happened because of the amazing country that we're a part of. Those 50 stars, those 13 red and white stripes that we sit under every single day, that's the opportunity that this country provides. And I'm committed every single day that I sit as the representative of this district to make sure that every single person has the opportunity to become whatever it is that they want to become. That's my commitment every day.
And Lauren Baer, the Democratic challenger, your closing argument to the voters of Congressional District 18.
Well, thank you, Michael. And I first want to say to the congressman, I salute your record of service. But this election is about the congressman's record in Washington, a record that has been consistent in voting for special interest, not the interest of his own constituents, a record that has been replete with examples of him saying one thing in district and then voting the other way. I look at how Congressman Mast has behaved over the last year and a half, and I understand why people are disappointed in our system. When you send someone to Congress and they vote to take away your health care, when they vote to put Medicare and Social Security on the chopping block and or increase the national deficit by $1.9 trillion, you might ask yourself, is this person voting for me? I think we can and should expect more out of Congress, and I hope to earn your trust and your vote.
Lauren Baer, Democratic challenger in Congressional District 18, and the incumbent Brian Mast, we thank you both for taking time to illuminate your views before the voters of a district covering Martin, St. Lucie, and parts of Palm Beach County. Again, a nationally watched race in the fight for control of the U.S. House of Representatives. And as always, thanking you for watching tonight as you prepare to make your vote in the critical midterm elections. I'm Michael Williams. On behalf of all of us at WPTV News Channel 5, I wish you a good evening.
With the midterm elections just days away, watch the competition for